Welcome to Discover Health, a White Mountain perspective. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Barela. Today, as we hope again, we're going to have a wonderful show, and we're going to talk today about first aid for mental health. An interesting concept to think about first aid for mental health, because we have mental health issues that seems to be all over the news recently. And to do this and have this conversation, we have a mental health first aid expert in the name of Becky Montoya, who is a licensed counselor at Blue Ridge Junior High School. And I'll say good morning to you, Becky. It is morning as we're taping this. And as I read the news and see the news, there's really a lot in here about young people seem to be involved with bullying, a lot of violence, we hear a lot of shootings, unfortunately, at junior highs and grade schools and high schools seem to be perpetrated by young people.
Yes.
Is this related to mental health problems? Maybe?
I think that's a very important question, because when we're considering the behaviors of young people in our community and in society, the big question is how much of what they're doing falls in typical adolescence range, and at what point are we outside of that range that would trigger some concerns. And we don't want to pathologize typical adolescence, but the examples you gave are definitely red flags to more, not just red flags, but indicators that there's more going on than just a typical adolescent experience. And yes, mental health is absolutely tied to that. Emotional wellness and mental well-being are completely factors in what we're seeing happen. Some trigger words or keywords in education today are bullying, harassment, intimidation, and hazing. And those words come up every day in some way or other in the school setting, either in an informative way to help a student understand their behavior, or because an infraction has taken place, or it's in the news and we have people wondering, how is this impacting our community? Because it's impacting society as a whole, and it's definitely having an impact on our community as well.
That's incredible. I remember as a pediatrician, unfortunately, I have to say that sometimes the somatic complaints of kids interfere with their going to school because of school phobia. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit, I have missed the bullying as a cause of somatic complaints along the way, mostly because when I think I did training a long time ago, it wasn't up on the forefront. And certainly as you describe this, these things are really aberrations of normal.
Well, the climate's really changed in a big, probably the most significant difference being the advances in technology. So young people don't ever leave a situation, because they always are plugged into their devices. And so any encounter that's happened at school is just perpetuated continually 24/7 if they choose to stay plugged in. So a situation that might arise at school in past times, you go home and you're done with it, and yeah, you have to face it again the next day, and it could still be very significant. But we see that the significance really has elevated due to the fact that that many of our young people are connected with their peers 24/7 all of the time. So when there's been a situation that's been stressful, they don't ever feel like they've been able to step away from it. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. You hear about kids living on their cell phones and devices, and we hear about actually a suicide earlier this year about a teenager who was coerced, I guess, through social media.
Right. Well, and their social perseverance is critical to their mental health, and now it's being defined by social media. They, in times past, our social perseverance was set in different settings where there was time on it and time away from it, and now they base their worth on how many likes, how many comments, how many friends they have. There's so much that's impacting how they feel good about themselves that's tied to the social media. So that is a big factor as far as thinking of a shift from then and now. That would be one that maybe some people may recognize the significance of, or might be surprised by how significant it is.
Wow. And I would guess as kids approach the teenage years, I always thought of it as a physician of kids making the transition between the black and white of early childhood, right and wrong, as you're taught by your parents, versus when you get out into the real world, which is really a gray world, and the adaptation that some kids have a hard time with. So I don't want to talk much about the roots of this, but there must be a lot of things that contribute to kids' abilities to cope.
Yeah, there are a lot of factors, and when you talk about the black and white and then how we shift into the gray as adults, I think sometimes as adults we've become comfortable with our gray areas, but in our roles with young people we still expect black and white. And so although we maybe have come into this place of realizing there's not all this rigidity, if we have a direct role with a young person, we still may really think there's significant value in keeping things very black and white, which can be, I know we're going to go into a few steps of how we can do this, but that can really prevent us from being effective listeners and being a soft space, a soft landing for the young people to express what's going on and the feelings that they're having.
The true perspective of a counselor.
Yeah. Yes.
True perspective. I like that. So let's talk a little bit. How big of a problem is it? I mean, in our community and nationwide.
It's a big problem everywhere, throughout the world. And youth mental health first aid is something that originated in Australia. The program was developed there, and it's being taught throughout the world. But when we focus in on Navajo County or our communities more specific, I think the first thing that comes to mind for anyone that's working with the youth is recognizing or being aware that suicide is at an alarming rate. It is, after accidental deaths, it is the #1 cause of young people in our community. And in Navajo County, we are 3 times the national rate of young people dying by suicide. So it's epidemic. It's the kind of thing that if we could tie it to a medical condition, we would be having immunization clinics and we would be really confronting it strong. And basically, youth mental health first aid is a solid effort to put that information out there so that we can not only provide those soft spaces and safe places for kids to talk, but we can maybe save some lives. And that's really what we need to do.
Well, let's talk about it then. Let's talk about first aid. How do we start with first aid?
So people are often familiar with the CPR model, and they maybe have gone to those trainings. And the model of mental health first aid is along those same lines. There's an acronym to go with it to kind of help remember some different steps of what we can do to be it's not trying, in no way is it trying to train individuals on how to diagnose or, excuse me, to provide therapy. The main focus is to heighten noticing skills so that we can be aware of the people and the situations, the circumstances around us, offer solid supports, and then know how we can take the next steps with that individual to help them continue down the path of wellness. Oftentimes, just those first few steps are all that's needed. It's not necessarily a plan that always has to go through every step. Sometimes what we are working with is an adolescents going through some very typical experiences, yet still troubling and very for real. And if we're able to offer that good listening, that good assessment in the early stages, then that might be the safe place that they need, and they might be able to strategize and function quite well from that point on. But other times we're going to take it further down the path to see how we can continue to give reassurance, whether if we need to encourage them to seek professional help, or if we can encourage them to find things that have helped them in the past and maybe plug those same things in for self-help. So there's just different, it's a plan that starts out a certain way, but then can take different paths depending on the needs of the situation that's being handled.
I noticed as you introduced, and we probably should regress at this point to say that you're a certified instructor in mental health first aid. And as I listen to you talk, it sounds like you have that program down, and so I want our listeners to recognize that you're certified to do this, and you give clinics, presentations 3 or 4 times a year. There will be more this year in Cholo, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But you obviously, how do we get started? How do you get started in the mental health first aid thing? I mean, those are all the background issues. How do you approach it?
Right. So it depends on, anybody can practice these skills whether they've taken a full training or not. The trainings that I'm offering are 8-hour days, and you just attend one, and we go through the whole mental health first aid program in that training. But I think what you're asking is, how could somebody, just anyone who's interested in being that space for somebody, what can they do? And I think the number one concern we have in our community and pretty much throughout the country is our rates of suicide. And so we want to be aware of the people in our lives, the young people particularly, and assess the risk that they might be at harming themselves or of taking their life. And by being aware of that and assessing for our concerns and being able to distinguish what's in the typical range and then when has it gotten into a range that I need to be more concerned. And a good example of that is there's some behaviors that are very typical. As a young person reaches adolescence, it's very typical that they want more privacy. That's a healthy, natural phase of adolescence. But wanting more privacy is not the same thing as totally isolating themselves and having secrets and keeping everything locked up all of the time. That would be more of a red flag. So privacy would make sense, but secrets and complete isolation, that would be concerning behavior. It's very typical in adolescence for a young person to take a step away from their family and be more immersed in their peer group. But it would be concerning if they stepped away from their family and their peers or started associating with people maybe a lot older than them or individuals that are making significantly riskier choices than they had made, than the young person had made prior. So it's kind of learning to distinguish between typical and red flag type behavior. So the more we heighten our noticing skills, then that's a first step towards assessment. And being able to, not assessment in a diagnostic way, but just assessing concern. And then our ability to listen non-judgmentally to these individuals, to be able to share with them what we're noticing, and then provide them a time and a space where they can share their thoughts and their feelings without having to be concerned that there's going to be a lot of judgment that comes with that. As parents, that can be incredibly tricky. And so allowing the idea of it takes a community to raise a child, sometimes as parents, we don't want the community to be a part of that. We think we got this. And even most amazing parents who are doing fabulous with their children sometimes benefit from allowing another adult to be a trusted person in their young person's life who they may feel safe sharing some of those concerns with.
So how important is the relationship between children and their parents in good mental health?
It's very important, but what I would differentiate is sometimes a parent brings to the parenting situation the best of intentions, but maybe a lacking skill set. And so we assume that if our intentions are rock solid, then that must mean we're doing a good job, and that's not always the case. We can have very solid intentions, but still maybe be having some hiccups in our parenting. Going back to the listening non-judgmentally, a typical parenting maneuver would be that if our child is sharing something with us, we may respond with, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're going through when I was a kid. And we take the focus off of the young person and we put it right onto ourselves. So we don't validate the experience they're having. We've turned it into something about us, and we aren't necessarily trying to dial into our young person's feelings. We're jumping into how we felt about it and maybe giving direction that our young person should be feeling the same way we felt when we experienced something similar. So the intention there was probably really good.
Good, yes.
But the skill may not have provided that safe, non-judgmental listening that the young person would benefit more from.
Wow. Well, how I guess the thing that I have on my mind is, how do we go about the actual steps of helping kids with mental health? You started a little bit on recognition, but there must be techniques that you teach that help parents. I mean, you hear about parents looking or being involved with their social media and being able to see their social media sites, monitoring your kids when they go out. I have, at least as a pediatrician and giving counseling, have talked about the issues of trust and between parents and parents giving kids a longer rope when they show that they can handle the longer rope. And I think all of these things are they not related to mental health stability?
They are, and when you say some of the skills, I think I go back to just some real basic ideas that can be happening in the regular dynamic of the household. You talk about trust and giving a bit of a longer leash, and differentiating between the love in the relationship and the trust in the relationship. Being clear with your children that love is this unconditional gift that I give you freely. Trust is based on some of the things you do to earn that trust, and the love is always going to be through the roof. The trust might kind of vary depending on some of the experiences we have together. But being clear that the love is solidly in place regardless of if the trust is kind of experiencing some fluctuation, like you said, depending on what the child or the young person has done to kind of lengthen that rope. I think it's also important when in the beginning you talked a little bit about black and white and gray. As parents and as adults in general, we have young people listening to us all the time, and they're making decisions about how we feel and the judgments we have, not just about them, but about society as a whole. What I find to be a common thread in young people is that they have a kindness and a compassion that is beyond what most of the adults in their lives can quite understand.
They haven't learned cynicism
They
yet.
haven't learned it, and they are very open to people of all types. They aren't rigid in their way of, there's some rigidity, but there's also just this gentle kindness that they pretty much have in them that they want to offer. But if they recognize that the adults that matter to them have a lot of judgments, whether it has to do with judgments regarding their faith and their religion, or their political views, or just their moral code, then that young person may start to think, I can't really go to this adult with what's going on with me, because they've made clear they don't accept those kinds of feelings or those kinds of thoughts. And so we have to be careful that we can, in our expression of our opinions and the views that we hold, to also make sure that we aren't making it so rigid that the young people in our life wouldn't come to us, because the number one protective factor for young people is having an adult they trust in their life. That is, when we talk about risk factors that would put a child more at risk, not necessarily for having a mental illness, but for acting in a dangerous behavior due to mental illness. Mental illness can be there's tremendous hope and productivity for people to live a healthy, effective life with mental illness. So it is not something that's going to ruin a person's life. And the more we can take away stigmas, which are really discrimination, and make clear that there's very hopeful opportunities for those struggling with anything in the range of anxiety and depression, all the way up to a diagnosable mental illness along the lines of bipolar or schizophrenia. There are people living incredibly productive lives with that entire spectrum. So we don't want it to seem like something that if we go down this path and we learn a certain thing about you, oh no, that's gonna ruin your future, because that isn't
not a stigma or a stamp.
It's not the case at all. So we want to make it this place where they're willing to explore what's in their best interest, and where we haven't made decisions about what a particular diagnosis, or often in the adolescence age there aren't diagnoses made. It's more of a process for a bit. It just depends.
And if I could, ask you, the main thing that we as adults, because unfortunately it seems to fall on us a lot to start the help process, to look for in a child? Is it the things you've been talking about, the isolations, the aberrant behaviors, the out of normal teenager? Is that what we look for?
Right.
And if we find it, what's the next step?
So the things I've been mentioning, anytime a young person, and this applies really to an adult as well, but anytime they're not being able to function in their regular day-to-day activities, or have healthy relationships, or a desire to have healthy relationships. So for a young person, that would be attending school, possibly a job, any of their extracurricular activities, and then that relationship piece. If they are unable to function or have no desire to function in those roles, those would be red flags. And the next step, depending on your role, it's really important to consider, what is my role with this young person? Am I their parent? Am I their teacher? Am I their neighbor? Because that's really going to give you some that's where you're going to know where your limitations are. And we also want to be very respectful of their legal guardian, so that we're not overstepping anything in that process. But there are some situations where, if it's in your role that you're a mandated reporter, then being a mental health first aider does not supersede that role. Like, whatever your legal obligations are in your roles professionally, you have to take those into consideration. And then also, as a mental health first aider, you then consider, okay, I am seeing all of these concerning behaviors. Is it time for me to approach this young person? Is it time for me to approach the guardian of this young person? And how do I do this in a way that's very safe, without judgment? And that if they're not open to this at this point, at least it kind of puts it out there as an idea they might be willing to consider down the road. Is this young person an imminent risk to themselves? And what steps do I need to take right now? What are the emergent steps that need to be taken immediately to keep this young person safe? And if that's the case, then those are calls to the authorities. We could go into a whole other session.
Yeah, actually, what I'm getting from this little vignette that you're talking about is that it's important to seek help.
Yes.
And it's important to seek help in a manner, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but of someone that they trust, someone that's stable, someone that they trust. I mean, there's lots of professionals like you are. I suspect you do this every day in your daily interactions in junior high.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when we approach, or we're having a conversation with a young person, I've mentioned how often our intentions are rock solid, but our skill set may be lacking. Don't let that scare you. If we flubber our words up and we don't say the perfect best thing to begin with, we can always go back and we can tell that young person, when you shared that really important piece of information with you, I may have acted a little shocked and surprised, but that wasn't really the reaction I wish I had given you, because what I wanted to do is just make sure you knew how important you are to me and how much you matter to our community. And let's kind of redo that. How can I be a good support to you? And then kind of go back and re-explore it. So if we haven't done everything perfectly, we're human too. And in our efforts to provide these supports, we may not dial it in perfectly each time. That doesn't mean we failed. That means we just go back and we approach the young person again, and we keep working on it. And you're right, I do this all day, every day. Often my words are dialed in pretty close to right. but not every time.
I know as a parent that certainly would be good advice, probably better 40 years ago or so. But let's kind of, because we're getting close to the end here, what can our community do? I mean, you obviously are teaching this program. How should we go forth as a community to approach our increased suicide risk, aberrant behavior? We have a lot of vaping up here. We have, drug abuse up here. How should the community help with the mental health issue?
Right. So all the things we've talked about definitely apply. When it comes to these classes that I'm presenting, we want to make these classes free of cost to any parent or person who works with young people in any fashion. Typically, to take a youth mental health first aid class, it costs $175 per participant. We are working with grants, we're working with the Blue Ridge School District, we're working with any organization or individual that wants to contribute to make mental health first aid a free course for anybody that wants to take it. I'm not charging any fee for myself to present the courses, so the only expense we have are supplies that we have to use to run the class. Every participant does have to get a manual, and so we have the cost of the manuals, and then if we have to pay any venue fees or if we're providing food. The services we've done so far, people have had to get their own lunches because we haven't had anybody sponsor the lunches.
It's an 8-hour course, so they gotta eat. You gotta eat late.
So
lunch.
if there's businesses or restaurants that want to contribute to anything on that part of it so that anyone wanting to take this class can take it free of charge, the more people who have this training, the more we're going to be able to fully support the youth in our community. Another thing we're doing, about a year ago, and with the permission of his family, I can share this shirt. We had a student, his name was Solon Spillick, and he passed away. He died by suicide. And so we are selling these shirts. The Blue Ridge Student Council is actually selling these shirts. And this is a traced image of Solon. He was just the coolest kid. And it says, "Your uniqueness is your magic. Continue your story." And then on the back, it says, "You matter. No one is you, and that is your power. Continue your story." And it has the Lifeline hotline, which is 800-273-8255, and the text line 741-741.
So, in finishing, if somebody wanted to take this course, how would they get a hold of you?
They can get a hold of me through the Blue Ridge School website. I'm right on there. It's B for Becky Montoya at brusd.org. They can send me an email and we can get them enrolled. Right now, I've got sessions set up through December, and we'll have a whole new set of training dates.
So now we have a way to get a hold of you.
Absolutely.
Becky, I'm going to say thank you. I learned. This was really good. Sometimes I think I would have been a better parent. And those of you in our audience, I hope that this has been informative to you. We have a first aid program up here in Show Low taught by Becky. You have ready access through the Blue Ridge School District, and I hope you will take avail to that opportunity, especially to ask this wonderful counselor for help. And thank you for watching.